Well, if someone asked you what it means to be a Christian, how would you respond? Maybe a good answer is that you are simply trying to follow Jesus. At its most basic, that is what we do as Christians. We follow Jesus. I don't know how you were raised, but I was told, don't get into the car with strangers. And when a company is interviewing people for a job, they check on the references and they find out who this person is and what they're like and what their background is before committing to them, right? And before I buy a product, I want to know if it works, and I want to know how it works. You just don't leap into the unknown, especially when it comes to relationships. Yet, Jesus walks up to these several people, and he calls them and invites them to follow him, and they do. They leave their nets, they leave their boats, they leave their family business, and off they go with Jesus. Now, I don't think it's unrealistic to think that they had some familiarity with Jesus before, maybe hearing Jesus teach or having a meeting with him before, but still. Not long after this, Jesus approaches another person, a tax collector named Levi, also known as Matthew, and calls him to follow him. And he does. Follow me. And that's the invitation to all of us. Jesus gives that to each one of us. And it is an invitation to be his disciple. Now, the word disciple literally means a student or a learner. That's what a disciple is, a learner. Being a disciple of Jesus is not about having arrived or having achieved some level of spiritual expertise. Simon and Andrew, James and John, they didn't know anything as Jesus calls them to follow him. But they will learn. But they get no special preparation. Jesus just says that he will help them become what he wants them to become. To follow Jesus is to be a disciple, a learner. Now, I've been following Jesus for a long time, and I am still learning how to do it every day. And if you want to know if you're a Christian or not, ask yourself, am I following Jesus? Am I letting him lead my life? Do I let him direct my life? That is what a person does who calls Jesus Lord. How do you and I follow Jesus? And what does it mean to follow? I had the blessing of being raised in a home where Jesus was known. But I didn't really start following Jesus until I was about 18 or 19. And that's when I came to the realization that I couldn't call myself a Christian and then live for myself. And at that time, Jesus became real to me. I understood that I had to be intentional about this, and it has been a learning, growing, life-claiming experience ever since. 3 things about Jesus calling these disciples. First of all, notice who he calls. The people that Jesus called to follow him, they were ordinary, common people. Jesus did not call priests. He did not call any religious leaders. Simon and Andrew were not from the best schools. They didn't have a high education. They didn't have great influence. They were what? They were fishermen. Levi was a tax collector, not a profession associated with great spirituality. And other disciples that Jesus later would call were quite ordinary. Jesus does not seem to choose his followers on the basis of how talented they are, or if he can make them perfect, or based on their potential for greatness. The people he surrounded himself with misunderstood him. They failed him. They frustrated him sometimes. But he wanted them. to follow him. We don't have to be something special to follow Jesus. We don't have to have a certain temperament. We don't have to have a certain level of knowledge or some exquisite background. The invitation is to all, because it isn't what we are, but it is what Jesus can make of us. It's not what we are, but what Jesus can make of us. Now, second, notice where Jesus called these men. When Jesus called Simon and Andrew and James and John, they were doing what they normally do. They weren't in a synagogue. They weren't praying. They were working. They were doing the same thing they'd been doing every day with those nets, casting those nets into the sea as fishermen. And when Christ calls us to follow him, he does it in the midst of our regular, everyday lives. He can call us from anywhere. And then third, notice how Jesus called these first disciples. He just said, "Follow me. Come after me." So simple. Now, it was highly unusual, if not unheard of, for a Jewish rabbi to find his own followers. It worked the other way around. A person would get to know a rabbi, study that rabbi's teachings, various rabbis, and then start following them around. They would choose what rabbi they wanted to learn from. This usually involves studying Torah. It involves studying the Jewish law and getting the rabbi's insights on this. But Jesus didn't say, "Well, I have a theological system I would like you to investigate." And Jesus didn't say, "Now I have certain religious theories I'd like you to think over." And he didn't say, "I have an ethical system of great morals that I want to discuss with you." No, he simply said, "Just follow me." Not even follow my teaching. He didn't say that. He said, "Follow me," because we follow a person. We follow Jesus. It begins with a person, and it is a relationship with him. You know, the great figures of the Old Testament, they never called people to follow them. Moses never said to anybody, "Follow me." David never said, "Hey, commit yourself to me." Elijah never got a bunch of people together and said, "You need to imitate me." Now, in the Old Testament, there is a call to walk in God's ways and his commands, but Jesus calls these men to himself. The call to follow Jesus for them, for us too, is not so much to a set of beliefs or to a particular church, but to the person of Jesus Christ. Which is why we need to know the Jesus that we're following. And we need to follow the real Jesus that we find in the Gospels, not the Jesus we make up with our minds, not the Jesus we think is the right Jesus, or that even certainly that the media portrays. And that's why we need to read the Gospels regularly. And then we know what Jesus said, and we know what Jesus did, and we know how he lived. Some think Jesus was all love, but he was never judgment. Some think that he was all about comfort, but he was never about challenge. Some think Jesus came to save souls, but they've never heard that he also talked about feeding the hungry and mercy being shown to the hurting. And when Jesus called these men to follow him, he gave them a task. You know, following Jesus is not a sedentary life. Follow implies you're going someplace. We are not called to just any old way of life, but we're called to a particular way of life. And that way of life is about serving Jesus. And there are different forms of serving Jesus, but it always comes from the same Spirit. And how Jesus calls you to follow him might be different than how he calls me to follow him, or the next person to follow him. But following will always involve moving, living, giving, serving, action for the Lord. Following is something a person does, not just what a person thinks or believes with their mind. To follow, I have to get up off my duff and go. Well, after more disciples have been gathered and then they've been with Jesus for a while, he calls the crowd, it says, to him and his disciples. And this is what he says. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. There it is again. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it, Jesus said, for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? We take up our cross and we follow Jesus. Now, the cross is how Jesus died. There's a certain dying and following Jesus Christ. Now, he didn't mean to hate yourself or that it's a life of self-denigration. But following Jesus is about losing myself in order that Jesus' life might be my life. Following Jesus is not about self-development. It's not about finding yourself in the way we talk about finding yourself these days. Some Christians use Jesus for their own fulfillment, some for their own agenda. And maybe you've been successful. Maybe you have a very comfortable life. And maybe Jesus wants you to step out of some of that and go with him. The call from Jesus is, follow me. He doesn't say, oh, you know what, I'll follow you. No, he sets the pace. We walk behind Jesus. And as we follow Jesus, we find our life. The way it works with God in some mysterious way is that in the giving comes getting. And in the sacrifice comes gain. And in the dying comes living. There is a joy and a blessing in living for the one who gave himself for us. In the losing of our life, we find our life. Following Jesus is it's a step of faith. Jesus didn't hand those first disciples an itinerary or a 12-step plan that he was going to, about how all this was going to work. Faith is an act before it's a belief. And only as Jesus is followed can he be known. And as we let Jesus lead our lives, we come to understand, I think, his love, his grace, his truth. I think we come to understand his voice a little better as we step out and get in the thick of it. We choose Jesus. We choose to follow Jesus Christ in our lives. And this is a process. He told those men, I'm going to make you become fishers of people. We become, he says, I'm going to make you become that because we aren't there yet. We aren't there yet. And to become something takes learning. We try to follow Jesus. We get things, and then we don't get things. And we have some successes, but there are times we fail, and we grow, and it can be a very slow and painful process sometimes. And then there are days I wonder if I'm making any progress in becoming what God wants me to be. Maybe the choice of following Jesus is something like having a child. It's full of joy, but it's also full of difficulty, you know? Parents rejoice when they're learning that they're going to have a child. They're expecting. But, you know, it's a challenge for that mother to carry the child for 9 months and bear that child. And then there are those early days, those early weeks, those early months of how do we do this? And there's a lot of sacrifices, right, with a child. Your life isn't your own anymore when you have a child, right? You're up at night, and you feed, and you bathe, and you see to the child's needs, and then you have to go to concerts, and ball games, and recitals, and more recitals. I swear I saw the Nutcracker 858 times when I was... If you want me to dance it, I'll do it some Sunday. I know it all. And you have to help with homework, and our children can be tremendously stable and have periods of great success, but sometimes they can be a challenge and go through times of rebellion, right? But yet there is something wonderful about being a parent. There are just great rewards, and we go between thinking we're crazy to do this to this is the best thing in my life. And it's difficult and it's fantastic all at the same time. Well, Jesus doesn't call us to follow him because it's going to make our life easier necessarily. It probably won't. But he does call us so that our life will be more fulfilling, more whole, more mature. Jesus was not about getting as many followers as possible. Never tried to attract as many followers as he could. He drew the line. He called for commitment. He raises the bar. We have large churches in some places today, and there's nothing wrong with that. We live in the age, though, of mega churches, and some people will do anything to put people in the pews. But have Jesus' standards of following him been compromised as we've tried to do that? In our quest to have as many people as possible, as discipleship suffered. We have mega churches, but we have fewer people in this nation that now call themselves Christian. There were times Jesus said hard things and people walked away. One time, he addressed a young man, and he told him to sell what he has, to give to the poor, and then he said, "And why don't you come follow me?" And that young man couldn't do it. And the young man couldn't do it and walked away from following Jesus sorrowful, it says, because he was rich and he had great possessions. It was just too much to give that up for Jesus. David Livingstone, the missionary to Africa who served in a very remote and distant area, was once asked by a missionary society. They wrote and they said, "Have you found a good road to where you are? If so, we want to know how to send other people to join you." And this is what Livingstone wrote back. "If you have people who will come only if they know there is a good road, I don't want them. I want people who will come if there is no road at all." Jesus doesn't want large crowds. He doesn't need large crowds. He wants disciples. He wants those who will be focused on his kingdom. He wants followers, not fans. How are you following Jesus? If we follow, again, then Jesus is in the lead. He is in the front. We are behind him. We go where he goes. Now, I know some of us have been doing this for a long time. But if this is new to you and you've never taken that step of surrendering yourself to the Lord, well, here is your invitation. How will you follow Jesus? I'd like to tell you that there's a 30-day trial period, and if you aren't satisfied, then you can get your money back and go another way. But following Jesus isn't about you being satisfied or me being satisfied. It's a commitment and plenty of turn back. There's a story of a man who lived in the mountains and he liked to go hiking, and in the winter there was a large creek that got very big and he had to cross it if he wanted to really go on his hike. It took a lot of effort to go across that stream. He had to make sure his feet were just on the rocks in the right way so he wouldn't fall. Had to get his footing, and it was much easier just not to cross, not do it. But he would take his coat and he would throw it over to the other side. And that way he had to cross over if he wanted to get his coat. And that coat committed him that there was no turning back. He had to go. Every day, wake up and follow Jesus. We don't always know how that's going to turn out or where it's going to take us or if we'll even do it well. But just follow him as best you can. If we hear his voice, respond. If we sense his leading, act. If we're convicted of a need, we will serve. We will learn from Jesus how to live our life, our whole and our real life. Not just some small slice of our life that we call religious. Doesn't mean even doing special religious things. We follow Jesus in our homes, with our family members, at work, as we parent, as we grandparent, with how we spend our money and with the activities in which we participate. When we follow Jesus, we pay attention to how Jesus intersects with every part of our lives. Those men who Jesus called away from those boats, they weren't called to save the world, and neither are we. But they were called to place their lives behind Jesus and point to him with their lives, to learn, to become, because that's what it means to follow. Let's all pray. Jesus, as we follow you, may our actions, our words, all of our lives reflect you. Show us where we need to die to ourselves so that we can live fully to you. We have so much to learn, and you know what each one of us needs to learn. Keep us from trying to take the lead, thinking that you will follow us. No, keep us behind you, walking in your steps. And may we follow our whole lives so that when our journey ends, it will end face to face with you. Amen.